Okay, so in the fourth set, we're going to turn our attention to the reptiles and the birds, because birds are actually reptiles. So we're down here with the organisms at the very bottom. The big thing about this group that we're going to look at is this idea of an amniotic egg. So let's step back for a second and take a look at an egg and see what's so special about this amniotic egg. This is an amniotic egg. The big thing about an amniotic egg that differs from an amniotic egg is this thing called the amniotic cavity. This is what the fetus floats in and remains protected from desiccation. Amphibians don't have an amniotic cavity. That's why they're amniotic, and therefore they have to lay their eggs in water. If you lay your eggs outside of water like the reptiles do, and then the mammals eventually, we have an egg, an amniotic egg. Our young are surrounded by an amniotic cavity, but we don't, we don't lay eggs. They stay inside. We still have all the same extra embryonic membranes that you see there. We have a chorion. A chorion in an egg creature is where the waste collects. The yolk is where the food comes from, and I already talked about the amnion. The allantois is where the waste collects. The chorion many times will grow up against the side of the egg and actually provide gas exchange between those. Now, the difference in the mammals, what mammals have done is we still have the amniotic cavity, and the allantois and the chorion and those extra embryonic membranes have actually fused and become part of the placenta. So still have the amniotic cavity, just don't have the shell anymore. So we talk about the reptiles and their dry skin and their ability to survive with their dry skin. That was their big hallmark. It prevents them from losing water. They use scales for it and keratin. There's a Komodo dragon coming out of its egg, by the way. The eggs in reptiles many times are less bird reptilish and more leather in texture. Living on land, internal fertilization, which is very common on land because of the drying conditions of land and what that would do to gametes if they were shed on the outside. And the circulation's improved, so these animals can get a little bit bigger, increase their metabolic rate, increase their size. You look down below, you see what's coming next, obviously the dinosaurs. And what we mean by an improved circulation is the heart is now partially divided. And put a little arrow there on the right to show you. It's still a two-circulatory system, still a three-chambered heart, but we might call it a 3.5-chambered heart, right? So the blood mix isn't quite as bad. So organisms can get a little bit bigger, a little higher metabolic rates. Crocodilians are reptiles that have a four-chambered heart. Birds have a four-chambered heart. Crocodilians and birds are actually very closely related. Birds are more closely related to crocodilians than any other reptiles out there. And mammals have a four-chambered heart, right? Metabolic rate has to do with that. These were ectothermic animals for the most part, except maybe the birds. The birds engaged in maybe behavioral thermal, not the birds. The birds are endothermic, but ectothermic behavioral thermal regulation is kind of what the lizards do when they lay out on the sidewalks in the afternoon and try to warm up. And we think there may even been some parental care. We have some indication that dinosaurs, and maybe even some parental and anting care, where the relatives of the female dinosaur with the young would help her raise her young. It's kind of interesting to think about dinosaur behavior. The evolution of the dinosaurs, reptiles. Earliest reptiles evolved about 310 million years ago. The big thing about reptiles is the skulls. There were three types of skulls. In the upper right, turtles have an anapsid skull, which is a very heavy skull. That brown dot is the eye orbit. Something called mammal-like reptiles. We're going to be talking about mammal-like reptiles and reptile-like mammals. This is kind of like the green algae thing again. Is it a protozoan green algae or is it a plant green algae? But the mammal-like reptiles had a synapsid skull with one opening in the back that lightened the skull, that little elongated circle. And then other reptiles like birds had a diapsid skull, and it was lightened even further. If you think about birds, that would make sense. Some of the earliest reptiles around were pelycosaurs, or an example of that is Dimetrodon. They had that sail on the back, which you might think for protection, but Dimetrodon might have been able to thermal regulate. Might have used that sail for thermal regulation. Dimetrodon, by the way, is not a dinosaur, but something we call a mammal-like reptile. In the Triassic period, early on in the dinosaur group, the Mesozoic, some other groups arose, the Lepidosaurs, which are the tuataras, the lizards and the snakes, and then the Archosaurs, which are the first land vertebrates to be bipedal. You see that Tyrannosaurus getting his legs up underneath him allowed him to move pretty doggone quick. Those front hands were pretty useless, and those back legs were definitely how this animal made a living. These were the first land vertebrates to be bipedal. Archosaurs also gave rise to the crocodilians, the pterosaurs, and then the dinosaurs, including the birds. The dinosaurs were the ones that dominated, though, 150 million years. They're all extinct now, though, except for the birds. Along come the therapsids. And that thing on the right that looks like a rat, that's actually a mammal-like reptile. That's a therapsid. They replaced the pelycosaurs about 250 million years ago in the evolutionary history. They were synapsid, has synapsid skull. We believe they were endothermic, and they went extinct. Most of them did, except for one group that gave rise to the mammals. And that's where the rest of the mammals come from. And now the mammals are on the rise, and the mammals are getting their comeuppance on the dinosaurs, like that little squirrel is. Let's look at the different groups. Look at the turtles first. The phylogeny of the turtles is a little bit unclear. We don't know if they're archosaurs or lepidosaurs, so that's why the data. But all turtles are characterized by having a carapace on the top, a dorsal shell, and a plastron on the bottom. Tortoises are terrestrial, while turtles are aquatic. Tortoises have a dome-shaped carapace, just like I helped you guys identify gopher tortoise burrow by its D-shaped, and turtles are mostly aquatic. They have a disc-shaped carapace. No teeth, no beaks. Eggs are laid on land. Green turtles will travel up to 2,000 kilometers to come back and lay clutches of 50 to 100 eggs on the beach in which they were born, which are born about 50 days later. Little ping pong size eggs, and all the little turtles come crawling out of there. It's very cool if you've never seen it. It's a neat little thing. I've been on the beach before when they've hatched. The lepidosaurs, the tuataras. There's only a couple species of these left. They used to be much more widespread in the Cretaceous, but now they're left to, I think, a couple dozen islands around New Zealand. 30 islands. The mainland population is actually being destroyed by cats because they eat the eggs, which is, of course, a human thing. An interesting thing about tuataras is tuataras have a parietal eye. That's the red arrows pointing to that little weird-looking scale. It's actually an eye with a lens and a retina. It's underneath a group of scales. Found at the top of their head, helps them regulate circadian rhythms to know the length of the day and the night. It's important for humans to do that too. We don't have a parietal eye, but we do have a pineal gland that I'm showing that picture on the left, which takes input from the optic chiasma, which is where the nervous input from your eyes are coming from. So that's where light would be coming from, and lets you know what the circadian rhythm of day and night. So we think maybe evolutionarily speaking, the parietal eye may have moved inside on mammals and became the pineal gland. Okay, we're now going to move down to the group called the squamates. These are the lizards and the snakes. So this is the reptiles. The squamata, this is the greatest numbers and diversity, about close to 8,000 species among the reptiles, except the birds. The birds have more diversity. Paired copulatory organs, again, which we've talked about before, like we talked about when we looked at the shark, right? The paired copulatory organs, the hemipenes, it's a spare, right? Life out there in the world is rough, and maybe you need an extra penis. Many lizards have the ability to regenerate their tail. There's a few venomous species, like the Gila monster down there at the bottom that the chipmunk is having a good time with. That thing on the left, that little thing that we see here in Florida, that's a reef gecko. There's a species in Florida, native, but there's also the Mediterranean reef gecko, which have come over from the Mediterranean area. The beaded lizard of Mexico is another, over on the right is another venomous species. And of course there's the Komodo dragon that grows up to 3 meters long and weighs 135 kilos. So that's a big boy. That's a blue-tailed skink. We have those in Florida as well. Skinks and lizard vary by, skinks tend to be smooth, and lizards have a little bit of a more texture to them. Snakes had a legged ancestor. There it is in the fossil record. A lot of really good carnivorous adaptations, sensors for chemical and heat, venom. They can disarticulate their jaws, their tongue. If you look in there's the hemipenes, by the way, that little picture, those are two hemipenes. What they use their tongue for is their tongue moves out and gathers molecular scent molecules from the environment, and when it brings it back in, it rubs it over, the tongue rubs those chemicals over something called a vomeronasal organ, and that's how they smell. So that's what that snake is doing when he's sticking his tongue out. He's actually smelling. Vipers, or at least heat-seeking vipers, can be have a heat-seeking pit, have a heat-sensing pit, and they have a vertical pupil. That's how you tell them. That's the old buddy, the cottonmouth. Their jaws can disarticulate too, so that's another thing. They can eat really big things, and if you see the picture kind of in the back, that's a alligator or being swallowed by a snake. Coral snakes, you see on the lower left, that's a red touches yellow, you're a dead fellow, not to be confused with milk snakes that look like that, but the colors are different. If it's red and yellow, that's the coral snake. There's a sea snake in the middle, and these big anaconda that live in the rivers down in Florida. And of course, our buddy, the eastern diamondback. That's a black racer on my back porch of a house I used to live in. So snakes are a way of life if you live here in Florida, but they're really excellent predators. All right, crocodilians are next. About 23 species found in warm regions, usually only. These are very carnivorous reptiles, stealth predators, where their eyes are, and their nose, a strong mouth and teeth. It's all for predation. You can see how they lay low in the water column down there. So these get pretty big size, like that one that guy's messing with there on the lower left. I don't know if I'd be that close to a croc that big. Crocodiles are typically nocturnal. Of all the reptiles, it's the crocodilians and the birds that are more closely related. They engage in maternal care. They have a four-chambered heart. We have alligators here in Florida. The only one we have is alligator mississippiensis. There's only two species of alligators, and they can climb fences, like you see that one on the picture there in the middle. Gavals, garrels, and caimans are all crocodilians in this group as well. If you've always wanted to know how to tell the difference apart, crocodilians, you can see teeth. You can see the lower teeth when their mouth is closed. And to me, from above, a crocodilian has a narrower snout than the alligator does. All right, I'm not going to talk much about the dinosaurs other than to kind of lead you into the only group of dinosaurs left, which are the birds. So that's the last group of reptiles to talk about, the birds. Birds still have a lot of reptilian features. They have amniotic eggs. Of course, mammals do too. They have scales on their legs. Think about a chicken leg. And they have no teeth, and they have no tail, so that's very much different. They do have feathers. And we think maybe, like we were talking about acceptations, feathers might have been good inventions and might have been good adaptations early on for warmth. We think that they developed from reptilian scales. They're made out of keratin. It's what I call an acceptation. If you look down below, we think what may have happened in terms of reptilian scales is some sort of appendage began to grow out. It became multi-forked, and then, a little bit more modifications, and you got yourself a feather. Now, I want to point out two types of feathers between feather 4 and 5. Feather 4 is a symmetrical feather, and feather 5 is asymmetrical, right? The way it's shaped. Asymmetrical feathers can't fly. It's hydrodynamics. Only symmetrical feathers cannot fly. Only asymmetrical feathers can fly, stage 5. So feathers were symmetrical before they were asymmetrical. So again, evidencing that flight wasn't the initial intent. The bones are thin and hollow that allows them to, to be able to fly. And a lot of them are fused, which gives them very strong flight muscles. You look inside if you think about a young chick, these stages of the feathers doesn't look too different than what we see on a young chicken, right? It almost looks like fur a little bit. Almost looks like hair. As a matter of fact, between birds and mammals from the reptilian line, it's kind of what they did. Birds went the feathered route, and mammals went more of the hair route. Flight is, of course, everything we know about birds. That's the big thing. And in order to fly, you have to be light. So they have no urinary bladder. The females have one ovary. The gonads only enlarge during the the breeding season. This is the same hormones that gets them to start singing. They have a four-chambered heart, very efficient respiratory system, lungs. They have air sacs, increased heart rate. Look at that. Hummingbirds have a heart rate up to 1,260 beats a minute. It's amazing. And they're endothermic, very high metabolic rate, very high body temperature, 40 to 42 degrees. What I mean about, what did I say, the way they breathe, birds, the picture of the guy with the canary in the coal mine, they used to bring canaries into a coal mine because birds are much more sensitive to gases in the air, and they'll die of increased levels of methane in the coal mine before the coal miners will. So when the canary died, it was time to get out because there was too much methane. That's the purpose of that. If we look at a bird like that blue jay up there, they have lungs and they have both front and rear air sacs. And so down below is the schematic of the way it works. So if we follow from the top to the bottom, so the bird breathes in the first breath of air, that's in red, and that goes to the posterior air sac where absorption occurs, gas exchange occurs. When the bird exhales the first time, the air doesn't leave the bird, it goes into the lungs. That's the part in the middle where more absorption occurs. The bird breathes in again, all right? That air that we've been following is now blue, and it's in the anterior air sac where more absorption occurs. The bird exhales again, and then that amount of air is exhaled out of the body. Of course, in the meantime, in the third step, when the inspiration 2 occurs, you also have another group of air moving back to the posterior air sac. So you're getting as much oxygen out of the air as you possibly can by running them through these air sacs and then through the lungs, right? More oxygen, you can be more efficient. Bird evolution evolved from the beast feet dinosaurs, the theropods, Sinosauropteryx, Velociraptor, Caudipteryx, and Archaeopteryx. There's your buddy Archaeopteryx and the modern birds. These are some of the dinosaurs along the way. What I've done in red is kind of put some of the interesting things like the shortening of the arms, the filaments for feathers, the swiveling wrist bone that Velociraptor had. That would have been important for birds. Caudipteryx had symmetrical but flightless feathers, and Archaeopteryx, there's Caudipteryx and Sinosauropteryx and Archaeopteryx, they had asymmetrical feathers, which means they could probably fly some short distances. The evolution of the birds was interesting because it's always amazing to me how sometimes little things make a big change in birds. This thing called the alula, if you look down below, when the alula first showed up in the fossil record, bird diversity, it just went crazy. If you want to know what an alula is, there it is on the bird feather, that feather labeled number 3. The alula acts like the flaps and the slats on a plane. You know, when the plane is landing or taking off, they'll extend their slats and their flaps, which allows them to get more lift. So that's what the alula does. It allows for birds for lower speed flight and still stay in control. First birds were, like I said, Archaeopteryx. That diversity increased during the Cretaceous, and then after the dinosaurs went extinct, the bird diversity increased even further beyond that. The fossil record is full of toothed birds with large breastbones. A large breastbone, again, being the idea that these were flightless animals, because large bones usually means large muscles are attached to them. You need large muscles to fly. There's a number of different bird orders, 28 of them. There's only 3 of them that are really interested. The ratites, which like the rhea, the ostrich, and the emu, which is an interesting lesson in convergent evolution. Those birds all look very much alike, although they're not particularly closely related to each other. But they look alike because they share similar habitats in each of those very wide places that they're found. A lot of times what happens with bird migration is birds were all together in one area, so the ancestor of these organisms may have all lived together when the continents were together, but kind of drifted apart as the continents drifted apart. Penguins, because they're kind of cool, they fly in water. And then the biggest group of birds are the Passeriformes. They came around during the mid-Cretaceous, and these are the songbirds. Passeriformes, about 60% of all species are all known by this rear-facing digit, or something called a hallux. Penguins are interesting birds. There's a cardinal, not to be confused with a Catholic cardinal, a red-shouldered hawk, red-tailed hawk. In the middle is a male, and a female grackle. The female grackle is a dull brown color. Male is a much brighter color. There's a scrub jay in the upper right and a blue jay below that, mockingbird above that, and then our buddy the laughing gull, which likes to keep us awake at the beach. Birds are one of the, many times people get into biology because of birds. They're one of the more colorful and interesting creatures to actually just sort of amateur-wise follow. The dodo. The dodo lived on the island of Madagascar. European explorers came to Madagascar in 1598, and less than 100 years they'd killed all the dodos. Dodos were big chicken-like birds. They were ratites, so they didn't fly. They lived on an island. They weren't used to predators. When humans came, they said, look at these dumb birds. They'll come right up to you, and we could just easily capture them and then eat them. And they did. In less than 100 years, they all went extinct.